spent most of his prison time in a 10 by 13-foot cell at Reading Jail. There was no toilet, no writing materials, and nothing to read but the Bible.
The intention was to make these prisons as unpleasant as possible. And that was done by working on every single one of the senses in an active and, in fact, very thoughtful way. You were kept on a diet which was designed to be enough to keep you alive, but not to make it worthwhile to live. Hunger went along with cold. You had to sit on a backless stool. This is a regime where a lot of attention has gone into making you feel really uncomfortable.
Special arrangements were made for pen and paper, which Oscar used to write a long, angry letter to Bosie Douglas. The letter would later be published by Robbie Ross, Wilde's friend and former lover, under the title De Profundis.
There is nothing that happened in those ill-starred years that I cannot recreate in that chamber of the brain which is set apart for grief or for despair. Every strained note of your voice, every twitch and gesture of your nervous hands, every bitter word, every poisonous phrase comes back to me.
He had 2 years in which he had to meditate on what had happened. And so, casting himself in the role of Christ, which he does in De Profundis, he goes out to find who his Judas was, and his Judas, in his eyes, was Alfred Douglas.
On May 18, 1897, Oscar Wilde was released from prison with what his friends referred to as the dignity of a king returning from exile. He left that night for France under the pseudonym Sebastian Melmoth, taken from his great-uncle's novel, Melmoth the Wanderer. His wife Constance had moved the children to Switzerland and reverted to the family name of Holland. She agreed to give Oscar £150 a year on the grounds that he never see Bosie again, but postponed a face-to-face reunion.
How could you possibly accept this man back in society who was a homosexual, who was a convict, and who was a bankrupt? You know, any one of those three things in Victorian times would have put you beyond the pale, and he was all three together.
At 43, Oscar Wilde was a ruined man. He had very little money and very few friends. In desperation, he arranged a rendezvous in Naples with Bosie.
When people speak against me for going back to Bosie, tell them that he offered me love, and that in my loneliness and disgrace, I, after 3 months' struggle against a hideous Philistine world, turned naturally to him. Of course, I shall often be unhappy, but still I love him. The mere fact that he wrecked my life makes me love him.
All hell breaks loose. Constance says, "You've gone back to your filthy, insane life with Alfred Douglas." Takes his allowance away. There's no chance then of him seeing his children. And about 4 months later, Constance dies. Well, with her death, there's the last possible chance of him seeing his children simply taken away. Nobody's going to let him see his children now.
After 3 months together, Oscar and Bosie parted ways. Alone again, Wilde moved to Paris. Once there, he used his prison cell number as a pseudonym, and in February 1898, published The Ballad of Reading Jail.
For they starve the little frightened child till it weeps both night and day. And they scourge the weak and flog the fool, and gibe the old and grey. And some grow mad, and all grow bad, and none a word may say. Each narrow cell in which we dwell is a foul and dark latrine, and the fetid breath of living death chokes up each grated screen, and all but lust is turned to dust in humanity's machine.
For a short time, Wilde was an advocate for the reform of English prisons, but at 45 he had lost both his will to write and his only source of income. All he had to sell was his personality, and very few people were buying.
In the middle of 1899, he writes a letter to a friend and says, like St. Francis of Assisi, "I'm wedded to poverty, but in my case the marriage is not a success." It's terrible, it's horrendous, it's the begging of money from friends, it's being without food for the evening because he's got not a sou left and he can't get credit anywhere. Those last letters are just heartbreaking.
On October 10th, 1900, Wilde had an operation on his right ear, most likely to repair damage from an abscess he had suffered in prison. Friends visited him at the Hotel d'Alsace, where he was living. Over the course of the next month, his condition worsened. "The wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death," Wilde remarked. On November 30th, 1900, Oscar Wilde died from cerebral meningitis. He was 46 years old. Bosie Douglas spent the rest of his life trying to come to terms with his past. He died in 1945, bankrupt and alone. In 1901, Robbie Ross salvaged Wilde's estate from bankruptcy and began a revival of his works. By 1920, Europeans were reading Oscar Wilde more than any English writer except Shakespeare. The man who had been crucified by society was once again celebrated. By the 1960s, he was being studied in universities, and in the 1970s, hailed as a hero by the gay rights movement.
A lot of what he was writing about then is as relevant today as it was back in the 1890s, which I think is really quite astounding. And for whatever his faults, you know, there were plenty of them, you can't help forgiving, I think, a man who has made you laugh consistently for 100 years.